Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us today from different parts of the world. And thank you very much for being with us. I am terribly excited to announce that we are launching a new conversation series. And today we will be talking about the Sufis, the legendary mystics of the Ottoman Empire, with the help of our dear colleague and friend, John Curry. Before I get into the questions and know more about Dr. Curry, I just would like to say a few things about this initiative. First of all, this talk series is meant for general public, non-specialist. By saying that, I just would like to, reduce the expectations, academic expectations from this series, simply because of the fact that, especially in the United States, we scholars complaining about the fact that, in academia, we produce a great deal of knowledge, scholarship on the Middle Eastern studies in general and Ottoman studies in particular, but that knowledge somehow does not trickle down to the general public, including but not limited to college students or general history enthusiasts. So in that regard, I hope this talk series is going to help general public to understand and to get some of the tidbit wisdoms from the scholarship produced in academia. And toward that end, we will do our best not to use too many technical terms, and not to get into also gory details of academic discussions. And secondly, our conversations will place humans and human histories at the center. What do I mean by that? As the title suggests, I am inspired by other ideas, mainly two ideas. One is the project, hugely successful project of Brandon Stanton's Humans of New York, where he began to photograph and document human histories, human stories rather, and then find some commonalities among those stories. And today, that project began almost 10 years ago, and today it has close to 18 million followers on Facebook only. And his book, turned to be a New York Times bestseller. The idea behind that project was to, again, look at human stories. And normally, when we, think or see that, street interviews are usually funny. It's almost like J-talk interviews. But this gentleman approached tens of thousands of New Yorkers in different time periods and then listened to their stories by not necessarily finding a great philosophy or wisdom in their talk, but by just listening to their stories. And those stories are the ones which makes us unique and separate from each other. So in that regard, that goes very well along the line with the idea that we humans, we Homo sapiens, are at the same time Homo narrans, meaning we are the ones who are storytellers for thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands of years. We humans, tell stories and then transmit our experience, human experience, or hundreds and thousands of generations. So in that regard, part of this project is about stories, which makes us unique, which makes them unique. And my second inspiration, when I was kind of thinking about this project and designing about this project, is the course that I'm teaching this semester, this year, at Honors College, called Human Situation, where with a team of scholars, we are we are just reading classical texts from the East and West, and then trying to find some common elements, some common humanity, some common big questions and answers, entertained by great minds from the East and West. We literally looking at, for example, Gilgamesh or Homer or Plato or Yunus Emre or William Blake or Ibn Khaldun or Montesquieu or Shakespeare or even Najib Mahfouz, and to find those universal elements, or universal elements in those ideas. So in that regard, while the first project is mainly dealing with particulars, the second, my second inspiration is dealing with universals. And we humans, in a way, are somewhere in between. We are, part of us is placed or situated in particulars, and yet other part of us is situated in universals. So we are somewhere in between. We are oscillating somewhere in between. But at the end of the day, when we look at the stories, unique human stories, or big questions entertained by great minds, I think all of our human endeavors are boil down to two major things, two major questions around. First, who are we? And second, how we should live? How we should live in this world? So this is the story of us, and as I said, this series is going to basically entertain with these two questions along the way. We are beginning this series with the Sufis, with the assumptions that they were the people who had like interest into these two big questions, like who are we, and then how should we live in this world. And in this conversation, as I said, our dear friend John Curry is going to help us. And as I said earlier, Sufism or Sufis or Sufi practices were such a common thing in the Ottoman Empire that the legend has it that by the end of the Ottoman Empire, only in Istanbul there existed close to 400 Sufi lodges, which was a clear sign of the commonality of this practice in the Ottoman Empire. Of course, by Ottoman Empire, when we say Ottoman Empire, we have to define that briefly as well. It's an empire which was born in the 14th century in Anatolia as a small principality and turned into a great empire after capturing Constantinople in 1453, and by the 16th century turned to be a global empire. And by the end of the 18th century, it began to shrink, but survived until 1920s. So basically, we are talking about a big swath of land stretching from Atlantic Ocean to Indian Ocean, depending on different times. So when we talk, we have to also keep that in mind, that we are talking about shifting borders of the Ottoman Empire in different sizes in different times. So who are these people then? What do they do? How were they spending their time? How were they different from regular Muslims in the empire or in the larger Islamic world? Anyways, so these are like what were like some of their ideas and practices, etc. So these are some of the questions that we are going to be entertaining today. And without further ado, I just would like to invite Dr. Curry to the podium, to the spotlight, to share his wisdom and his experience with us. But even before that, maybe I should say one more thing, that my thanks are in due. Last but not the least, I just would like to thank also Yunus Emre Institute and its director, Halvet, who invited me to launch this talk series. Okay, without further ado, now Dr. John Curry, who is an eminent scholar, a prominent scholar on Ottoman Sufism, who wrote several books on the subject, and articles too. Obviously, gave several interviews and talks. And currently, he is teaching at University of Nevada, Las Vegas, on various subjects stretching from ranging from world history to Islamic and Ottoman history. Okay, Dr. Curry, in keeping with the thrust of this special talk series, I want to start talking about you first. I mean, who are you? Can you please tell us a bit more about yourselves, and how did you develop an interest into this subject, and how was your experience with like studying this subject or these people? How was again? Who are you to begin with, and how did you develop an interest into the subject?
Yeah, before I proceed, I did want to offer my thanks and gratitude to the Yunus Emre Institute for hosting me. Also, since this is the first podcast in this series, I'm always tempted to start with a famous Sufi expression that often begins any kind of lengthy discussion, which is this poor one full of faults, bu hakir pur taksir, as they would say in old Ottoman Turkish. So hopefully I will do my best to not be too full of faults here, despite the fact that I probably will. I did have a few images that might help to conceptualize some of the things that Cengiz was talking about. So I'm going to try and put this up. Let me know if it works. Can you see it, Cengiz?
Yes. It is perfectly visible. Thank you.
Okay, then I will keep it like this, and hopefully it will help out. To start with, I'm a scholar of the Ottoman Empire primarily, which, as Cengiz pointed out, is a massive geographical entity. This is always the classic map that I show my students in class, sort of documenting how the empire emerges in the 14th century and then spreads across 3 continents and controls much of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea region. So we're dealing with a very diverse, very geographically complex imperial dominion. And the reason that's important is because the kinds of Sufi figures that I look at and that I encounter are often as diverse as the geographical regions and ecologies that they come from. And so the question then becomes, who am I and how did I happen to get into this particular subject? Well, the reality is I didn't start my career as somebody who studied Turkish culture or the Ottomans. I actually got my start studying Arabic and the broader history of the Islamic world with Carl Petrie at Northwestern University. And then eventually I went to the Ohio State University and worked with Jane Hathaway, Carter Findlay, and other scholars there, Stephen Dale, who did the Mughals of India. And there I sort of became an Ottomanist, sort of building off my earlier studies in Arabic. So Sufism was a good fit because I had already looked at kind of the Arabic and the religious literature and things like this already. And then I could integrate it into the study of Turkish and the Ottoman context as well. This eventually led me to begin working with the Sufis. And not only did I work with sort of the manuscript and the historical literature that's out there, I also eventually realized that places like Istanbul and some of the more rural town environments of Anatolia in central Turkey today were full of all kinds of material remnants, like the Sufi tombstones that you see here. And I was able to use this sort of mixture of various kinds of Sufi sources and remnants to begin piecing together a narrative about the Ottoman Empire and the ways in which Sufism, as Cengiz has pointed out, was a major social presence in that particular context up until the Republican period, where it was sort of semi-prescribed. But it started to come back in a big way in recent years with some of the political and social changes in Turkey. And so I happened to arrive on the research scene to work on this topic right as these changes were beginning. And so I sort of went from one person sort of, interested in working on this material, at least outside of Turkey itself, to someone who was quickly joined by a variety of different people who were interested in it. From that point forward, I eventually sort of developed a series of studies on Sufism, in particular in the Ottoman Empire. And one of the major Sufi orders, a sort of group of Sufis arranged around a certain kind of teaching and leadership that comes from sort of an initiatic founder, was an order known as the Halveti, whose primary practice was to withdraw into long periods of isolation to sort of deepen one's mystical experience. And in the pictures you can hopefully see here on the right, this is a major Halveti mosque in the town of Kastamonu. And if you look closely, you can kind of see in the back of the mosque there on the various levels, little doors leading into sort of tiny square cells where you can sort of retreat, close the door, and spend long periods of time in solitude and darkness to begin to kind of learn more about or develop more your relationship with God. The basics of Sufism we'll get into in a minute here. But one of the things I learned about Halveti Sufi practice was that it was based on several key concepts. And here we have to keep in mind that Sufism is not a different kind of sect of Islam like Sunni or Shia. It's more of a sort of method of practice. And a way in which you approach the religious tradition. And it doesn't particularly matter what sect you belong to. You can have your own sort of form of Sufism based on your sort of personal relationship with a sheikh and a teacher of the various kinds of Sufi paths. And in the case of the Halveti, they based their path on what was called the Adwar Sabah, which basically means the 7 stages. And the early stages are basically devoted to trying to recognize your sinful behavior, your bad nature, and to attack that and to sort of eventually strip that away from your personality. And then from there, you move to acquiring various kinds of virtues, the simpler ones at first, and then more complex forms of virtue that require a bit more challenge. And then from there, you eventually begin to go into these lengthy 40-day retreats into solitude to sort of ponder your progress on these paths. And so this Erba'in, as it was called, the 40-day retreat, sort of marked the point where you could move into a position of becoming more drawn into the proximity of the divine essence that's sort of all around us and is sort of part of our everyday life. And in particular, often in these 40-day retreats, you would go without much in the way of food or drink or any kind of human contact. And you would often sort of go into sleep and see various kinds of vivid dream visions that then could be interpreted by your sheikh for guidance as to how to proceed. In this regard, the Halvet sort of grew out of earlier Sufi groupings, primarily in Iraq, an order known as the Sufi order, which spawned a lot of the different orders that moved into the Ottoman Empire, India, and other places in the Islamic world. They seem to lie at the foundation of this as well.
John, before getting into these, technical details about the Sufi history, Sufi traditional history, let's just start perhaps some other basic questions, some basic definitions, since again this series is meant for general audience, and then we'll come to general history of Sufism in a moment. As we said, it is such a common practice in the Ottoman Empire, particularly. That would be also the case in Safavids and Mughals and in other Islamic empires too. But since we are talking about the Ottomans, if yes, we don't have an Ottoman street today, but imagine that we have, and then you just go out in urban or rural settings. What are the likelihood of you are meeting with, say, people, and then the chance that they are being Sufi? Were they men, woman, children, or all? They were in urban settings or in rural settings. Again, I'm wondering again, when you go out in the Ottoman Empire, what is the likelihood of you are meeting with them?
Mm-hmm. Well, this picture you see here is actually right across from Topkapı Palace in Istanbul, which is where the Ottoman rulers had their seat of power for much of the Ottoman Empire's history. So what you see here is sort of the graveyard and the tomb complex of one of these Sufi leaders, was literally perched right outside the gate of the Ottoman Empire, in very close proximity to the various markets and the sort of centers of people from all walks of life, sort of coming and going around the palace and the great Hagia Sophia Mosque and the Blue Mosque and all of these places. So we can sort of see that they're sort of just right there along with everybody else, with a sort of permanent fixture. And while the lodge has since been torn down, that would have been there too, where the Sufi sheikh lived. And there were probably, as Cengiz pointed out, hundreds of these kinds of places, or even just local Sufis kind of living in their own home somewhere in a neighborhood. So the chances that you would run into them were probably pretty high in a place like Istanbul. Now, if you go out more to the rural areas, this is a famous Sufi complex in Kastamonu that I shot from on top of a old fortress in the center of town. That was sort of the center of defense. And what you see here is the dome in the middle of the picture is the Sufi founder's tomb. You can see the mosque in the background with the minaret, and then to the right of that is the building that would have been the Sufi leader's home and lodge, where he would host followers and the like. Now, you can kind of see in the background of the picture, the road is sort of going off into the countryside. So these kinds of places were often located on the edges of town or just outside of it. But nevertheless, they were sort of important parts of the local culture and infrastructure. And people were always coming and going from the kind of central regions of town out to these places for various worship or to gain the assistance of the sheikh as a kind of a local and social leader. So the
John, sorry to interrupt again. I mean, we have some demands from the audience saying that can you just switch to the full screen mode if you can? Apparently they are not able to
full screen mode.
Yeah, if you can. I think.
Let me see if I can figure out how to do this. Here we go. Let me cycle through to the right picture here. And there we go. How's that?
I think audience should say, anyone who are watching us. Yeah, it doesn't work. Can you just do like Alt F5?
Okay.
Alt F5.
I just went ahead and did that.
Does it work? I think, all right. I mean, if it doesn't work, just let's not waste so much time on that. All right.
Okay.
We should just go what we have now. All right. Sorry for the interruption. Please just continue your story.
It's just the chances that you were going to run into somebody in this particular context was probably pretty good from about the 1500s onward throughout much of the empire. And from that point forward, it was probably pretty difficult to live in a place that didn't have some kind of Sufi figure present, with the exception of maybe the more remote village or rural environments.
All right, perfect. Let's just go to the basic definitions of Sufism again for those who are not so familiar with the subject. And what is Sufism? Who are Sufis? Are they simply the mystics or like spiritualists that today we commonly refer to like a general human experience with sacred, divine, or absolute? I mean, how can we define them in basically briefly?
Sufism, for the Sufis themselves, their origins go back all the way to the Prophet Muhammad himself, who is sort of considered the eponymous founder in most ways of all Sufi orders. Many of them then track their lineage back through his son-in-law Ali ibn Abi Talib, and various chains of mystics that then sort of descend down from his spiritual lineage. Sufism also draws support from various kinds of Quranic verses. Some examples include the famous verse of light, which we see here, that has rhetoric about light upon light, as God's power and transcendence being connected with sort of endless light that can be sought by some kind of mystical idea. And then there are other verses, such as a verse that God is nearer to us than the blood in our jugular vein in our neck, which suggests that God is imminently with us. And so mystics were able to sort of use this kind of an idea to build upon that. There's also verses like chapter 3, verse 7, which suggests that some Quranic verses have very clear and obvious meanings, whereas others are allegorical or require significant thought, or are not going to be fully understood by the person who hears them the first time, thereby inviting some sort of mystical or deeper speculative path to be able to better understand God's meaning in the Quran. Some Sufis locate their origins in a group known as the people of the bench, or the Ahlul Sufa, who were sort of a group of people who sort of lived in a open air shelter just outside of the prophet's house. And whenever the prophet needed something, they would just sort of jump up and help out, or sort of just sit around listening to everything he said and trying to gain a better understanding of Islam through him. And this sort of is sometimes cited as the model for future Sufi dedication to one's master or sheikh or teacher. From this point forward, mysticism, it began to evolve as a reaction against the things of this world, and instead a sort of worry about the next. And the earliest mystics are sometimes called weepers because they were always sort of weeping about their sins and the fact that this was an obstacle to their own salvation. This was radically transformed by one of the great female Muslim figures in human history, a woman named Rabia al-Adawiya. And she actually seems to have questioned this emphasis on asceticism and always weeping about one's sins, and said, the real issue in mysticism is about God's love. It's not about being afraid all the time and being, scared of your salvation and things like this. And she famously said at one point, God, if I try to gain your favor by fear of hell, then just put me in hell. And if I'm doing everything for you out of the hope of gaining paradise, then don't grant me paradise. But if I worship you solely for the love of yourself and your own sake, then decline me not your eternal beauty. I'm paraphrasing, this isn't the exact word. But you get the sense that she sort of had this remarkable insight that mysticism had to be about love. And from this point forward, most mystics followed her lead and began to develop mysticism much more along these lines of a relationship with the transcendent. And this eventually would evolve into the idea of what are called the friends of God, or the awliya in Arabic, which draws support from the 10th chapter of the Quran. It suggests that people who are able to establish this loving relationship and to gain a certain proximity to God's sort of transcendent immanence, this allows them to sort of have an important place in the cosmological worldview of Muslims. And this could get quite complex, as we'll see later on.
You are right. I mean, if one asks what would be the most important concept in Sufism, probably the term love or ashq would come to the fore. That it is the central concept in Sufism, which is also something similar to other Christian concept of love, or even other traditions, other like mystical traditions also. Make an emphasis on that. That would be a good segue to talk about a very brief history of Sufism. You have already started saying that there were different traditions from the beginning, and an origin of it could be traced back to the times of Prophet Muhammad, but there are discussions on that. We don't need to get into that. But we know that it has its origin somewhere in the early centuries of Islam. But along the way, we began to see the emergence of different paths, different Sufi orders, different ideas. Some of them were even competing. Can you just tell us again, very briefly, story or history of Sufism before Ottoman Empire? And then we need to quickly move to the empire, Ottoman Empire, and talk about some of the other developments in the empire. Given the fact that we have only 20 minutes left, I just would like to go a bit faster. Okay, please.
Yeah, and it's fairly quick in this regard. I mean, once you sort of get into this period after Rabia, there's a whole host of different Sufi paths and thinkers that begin to emerge pretty rapidly. And by the time we get to the beginnings of the Ottoman period, there's a sort of whole host of different orders and teachers. And in the case of the Ottomans, they inherit a number of very important Sufi groups, the most famous of which is the Mevlevi order, sometimes called the whirling dervishes in Western contexts. And they have their center at Konya in what today is central Turkey. And we see here in the pictures on the bottom right, Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi, the founder of the Mevlevis, his tomb and the mosque complex is still very much there and still very much functioning. And you can see that groups like the Mevlevis began to develop various kinds of highly public practices, such as what were called the Sema ceremonies, which were often various kinds of ritual movements and sometimes musical accompaniments that sort of sent litanies and prayers to music, and then the devotees would carry out various kinds of public rituals that were designed to sort of increase the devotees' proximity to God. And eventually, even members of the lay public would come to these ceremonies just to sort of try and get a taste of what this experience was like. And by the High Ottoman period, it was very common for large groups of people to gather, often on Thursday nights, before the Friday Holy Day, to carry out these kind of all-night ritual performances and experiences, which were often then followed by a meal for all the attendees hosted by the sheikh. And they were highly social and very fun gatherings to be at if you were an early modern Ottoman person.
I mean, in that regard, I mean, one would talk about also what would be like this appeal, draw of Sufism and why people were attracted to it. I mean, it seems that, while philosophers and theologians tend to see the world as binaries, as opposites, I mean, Sufis probably are not so happy with that and try to unite the opposites and then see things in a holistic manners. And then they just they have a different take on that issue, which is quite very interesting. Speaking of again Sufis and Sufi rituals and Sufi experience, just to get into the very practice of Sufism, that there is this relationship between master and disciple. So if you zoom into Sufi practice, at the very center of this practice, we see a relationship between a master and disciple, or a sheikh and dervish. And around that, we see a Sufi convent that they just meet in particular places. Can we talk about this relationship between, again, Sufi, like sheikhs and dervishes, and then the places that they are meeting, and what are the characteristics or difference of these places? For example, difference from, say, mosques, and how the Sufi convent and then the relationship in that convent is different than, say, mosques.
And I mean, this really could take on all kinds of different forms, really. I mean, at the basic level, the vast majority of devotees to some form of Sufism never really advanced beyond the primary stages of the path. It was sometimes said of Sufi masters that they had, tens of thousands of followers, and this, in some cases may have been pretty close to the truth. But most of them probably didn't advance beyond the sort of basic idea of trying to somehow be a better person through the Sufi path. If you did become a sort of more advanced follower of Sufism and sort of became very close to the inner circle of the sheikh, then things would change markedly. You often did what was called an initiatic ceremony, or the bayah, in which you sort of pledged your allegiance to a particular sheikh. And as the saying went, you basically commended yourself to him as the corpse would be commended to the corpse washer for a funeral.
Mm-hmm.
And you would just sort of follow everything that the sheikh told you and take every kind of advice that he would give you. Even if it was the most strange and ridiculous thing, you would just go and do it because there was always some ulterior meaning behind it that you needed to learn. And Sufi literature is always full of stories of people who just said, well, that request is so ridiculous and contrary to good behavior. Why would I do something like that? And then later on, they learned that the sheikh had an ulterior purpose in doing so. And they had egg all over their face after this. They were embarrassed, and they had to go and apologize and things like this. So the warning is always, whatever the sheikh says, he's got a reason. You need to follow everything in the teachings.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So this is, kind of the essence of the relationship. And the picture I'm showing here is actually kind of an interesting one because it's in a mountain pass in a very remote part of central Turkey. And what this basically is it's sort of a combination of a mosque, a Sufi lodge, and it even has sort of facilities for, what we would call today a hotel. So travelers coming and going could sort of stop in at this Sufi convent and sort of have a place to stay as they were traveling through this mountain pass. And what this tells you is that often travelers were important parts of Sufism as well. And often they would pick up word of various kinds of Sufi teachers, even in remote places, and then spread news of them all throughout the empire. So sometimes people who lived in remote places could become surprisingly well known throughout many parts of the empire through these kinds of practices. So the relationships could range from the most casual stopover in a hotel inn kind of place to very in-depth relationships where you essentially were in the proximity of the sheikh as much as you possibly could and sort of followed some very in-depth teachings.
I mean, can we say that the Sufi sheikhs, in some contexts especially, were seen as almost like the messiahs or Mahdis in a way, in the sense that they are the ones who are kind of bringing the paradise to earth. I mean, that's something. Some other goal. I mean, some of the other goals of the Sufis that they are looking for something else. They are looking for a different kind of knowledge, different kind of experience. Perhaps they are not all of them, obviously, but especially theoretically minded ones. They are the ones who are attaining or experiencing, the experience of paradise on earth. And in that regard, I mean, they're expecting things from Sheikh as being healer and also redeemer. Can we make this connection between a messianism and mysticism in that? Not mysticism, but Sufism in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Well, and actually, this is one of the controversial aspects, doctrinally speaking, of Sufism as it emerged in the Ottoman period. Is often sheikhs were not viewed by ordinary people as sort of advanced mystical teachers. They were viewed as sort of the local healer in an era before doctors were sort of widespread and available to the population. Often some kind of intervention from a higher power was the only way a woman could, for example, save one of her children who had contracted a very serious disease. And sometimes people, contracted chronic conditions, such as what was called scrofula, a kind of like a horrible infection of the scalp and the head. And there are stories of sheikhs kind of, licking their hands and rubbing them on the scrofula, and the scrofula goes away. And then there's also a lot of stories of women who bring children to sort of the sheikh to be, treated, and then the child miraculously recovers, and the woman just kind of spreads this far and wide, despite the fact that the sheikh tries to be modest and say, look, this is God answering your prayer, it's not me. And this was kind of actually the problem, because in Islam, God is supposed to be radically transcendent. There isn't supposed to be somebody on earth who can sort of mimic the powers of God. But the Sufis sort of did emerge sometimes into this kind of intermediary role, where if you wanted to have some kind of channel to be heard by God, you would sort of use their institutions or their person as a way of trying to get a better hearing. And in some periods of Ottoman history, various kinds of puritanical movements emerged that criticized this and said the Sufis are trying to take on a power that they're not entitled to in Islam, and therefore we should shut down their lodges and banish them from public society and return to the basic message of Islam, which is that there is God here and there is humanity here, and there's no sort of special intermediaries in between. But these kinds of movements usually didn't gain enough traction to really stomp Sufism out, although I would argue that they did ultimately evolve Sufism in the Ottoman period towards a much more doctrinally correct and careful presentation of the issues. In the early Ottoman period, Sufis seemed to have no trouble with kind of various kinds of wonder working, for instance, whereas by the later periods, Sufi leaders tended to downplay that as a distraction and say, look, this isn't the point. You're supposed to be doing this.
Awesome. I mean, that's perhaps also important to talk about. Would be important to talk about, like, the places of Sufi shrines. I mean, they are somewhat ambiguous places where many people from different walks of life and also from different religions are attending and expecting some healings, and that has always been the case during the Ottoman Empire and also pre-Ottoman times. And this very fact of, the shrine of a holy man is an idea which is transcending also Sufism and going all to other traditions as well. Speaking of, again, an Ottoman Sufi experience or the experience of Sufi tradition Ottoman Empire, is there any particular thing which is unique to Ottoman Sufism? Or can we talk about Ottomanization of Sufi tradition in particular? I mean, was it anything special that Ottomans contributed to this tradition other than, say, Middle Eastern or Safavid or Mughal traditions?
Well, and that Genghis is the $64,000 question. It is a major point of debate among people who study this. I have some colleagues who argue that Sufism, as we understand that today, is an entirely Ottoman period or Mughal period creation, and everything sort of has to be filtered through that lens. Other people argue that the Ottomans took a strong pre-existing tradition and merely sort of spread it more broadly. So there's almost no agreement on how to think about this. I can only sort of give you, what I think. And what I think is probably a position somewhere between these two poles. The Ottomans inherited an Islamic world that had been deeply fragmented by the Turco-Mongol invasions and migrations, which had destroyed a substantial part of the Muslim institutions that had emerged during the formative period. And often the only people who were left throughout much of this vast region of the central parts of West Asia were people like the Sufis who could move around and who were comfortable operating in these environments that were full of people who were non-Muslims or even only loosely Islamicized. Jalaluddin Rumi, for instance, is the son of what basically is a refugee from the Turco-Mongol invasions in Afghanistan, who migrates all the way to Turkey, and he settles there as a child. And in his following, you find, according to the narratives, Christians and Jews, and maybe even a Zoroastrian floating around or two. And so, they were comfortable with this kind of environment in a way that others were not. And they were able to sort of play the role of the people who could gradually Islamicize these mixed populations of people who were only nominally Muslim, or in some cases not Muslim at all. They were willing to go out into these distant rural climes and sort of teach the faith to people in farmlands. There's a famous text that I began my career with that documents how there's this guy who goes from Istanbul and wanders around in rural Asia Minor. And he goes out to the fields and literally instructs people on how to behave and what they should do with their animals and how you should revive wastelands to try and make the community more prosperous. And so often for many people who had very little connection with what we might call doctrinal Islam, this was the person who could kind of teach them the basics. Since they often were, they didn't even sometimes have a local mosque close by to sort of go and give their prayers in. These were the kind of figures that sort of literally established Islam as the Ottomans knew it. And in terms of the orders themselves, they developed a strong literary tradition of how to sort of teach these various kinds of Sufi orders principles to people. And they often translated many of the classic works in Arabic and Persian into Turkish and sometimes other languages as well, so they could be more accessible to people. So the Ottomans have to be given credit for broadening the range and the understanding of Sufism beyond certain elite, literate, well-educated groups to encompass all walks of society. And they often were extraordinarily successful in that.
Thank you very much. I mean, we are really approaching to the time. I know that there are so many questions in QA and also in the chats. There are some also complaints about the way we are, exercising this conversation. But that is the format that we thought that it would be nice to have. There is no way for us to answer all the questions. Still, however, I would like to take some questions before the time. But I have still one more question in order not to be, not to have like an incomplete conversation between you and me at this point. That was the romanticization of Sufi history. That was about the romanticization of Sufi history. I mean, we tend to see that history something flawless, something perfect all the time. But we all know that there were so many Sufis, so many Sufi traditions, so many Sufi orders who were in times on a collision course, who were in times competing and fighting and whatnot. And they were like claiming or blaming each other as being heretics and whatnot. Can we also talk about some of the imperfections, if you have any examples from history with regard to that history, very briefly? And after that, I want to answer or at least ask you a few questions coming from our audience.
Well, it should probably be stressed here that the Sufis themselves were, the first to often point out their own imperfections and failings. A powerful sense of humility is at the core of Sufism. And even the greatest sheikh would, basically say, even I mess up once in a while, and here are some of the dumb things I've done, and things like this. There's even a famous story in one Sufi manual that I read where the prophet Moses, was going up to the mountain on Sinai to receive various kinds of revelations from God. And God, told him at one point to go down and find the most abject and worthless creature that he could and bring him back. And so Moses went down and looked around until he found a very mangy dog that was really sick and about to die. And, then he started bringing it back up the mountain, and the dog kind of looked up at him and spoke, and he says, will you really put me before my creator, in this kind of a state, And Moses said, you know what, you're right. He let the dog go, and he goes back to God, and he says, God, I am the most abject and worthless being. And God said, I'm glad you figured that out, because if you had, I would have cut you off from all of this on the spot, because you wouldn't have gotten it right. So, this is obviously an apocryphal story, but it's one that sort of expresses the Sufi worldview almost perfectly. And Sufis also had sometimes problems with political power. If they got too close to, say, the Ottoman ruling class, they sometimes began to occupy a position that was at odds with their own humility. And often Sufis would criticize other, Sufis for getting too close to worldly power, and demanded that they step back from that. So it's not so much even what we think of them, it's that they themselves were always constantly in a form of self-criticism. And that's what I think is really the greatest thing about them, is, they never, seemed to get too full of themselves, and they always brought things down to earth. And I think that's always what I appreciated most about them, is they came across, as this entire lecture series will point out, as eminently human. Even if they occupied a status and piety and sanctity that seemed to be far above their contemporaries at times.
Awesome. Thank you very much, John. I mean, I'm gonna be again selecting a few questions from the audience. Again, there is no way to do a justice to all the questions. Nevertheless, again, I have to pick a few of them. One is asking. Let me just ask 3 questions to you at once, and then you choose however you want to answer. One is asking about the role of woman in Sufism, the place of woman in Sufism, and then another one is asking about whether there is a concept of karma in Sufism, and another big question is asking about like the current contemporary status of Sufism in the world today. I mean, again, you don't have much time, but please just try to entertain some of these questions.
Yeah, certainly, and I'm glad that somebody asked about the role of women in Sufism, because this is something that's only just starting to emerge, and it's hugely important. My own research in the manuscript library has turned up some astonishing finds. For example, I found a book that's supposedly written by a male author, but he derived about half of the book through his mother, who was actually much more highly placed in the Sufi order than he was. And so we can sort of get all this inside information about how the women of the Sheikh's family function. They were very much ensconced in the everyday life of the order. They were often ranked higher than the men in this regard due to their proximity to the Sheikh and their devotion to the Sheikh. And, we often find in the hagiographies, the narratives of the Sheikh's lives, a lot of the stories are clearly said by women. And they sort of explain something that they saw the Sheikh do that was evidence of their sanctity. And then at the end of the narrative, they'll often say, and you make sure that I'm the one who told them that. Women play a very important role. And people who observed the Sufi orders in action, both people who were friendly to them and sometimes even those who were hostile to Sufism, they often either noted or complained that a huge number of the followers of the sheikhs exercises and everyday Muslim life in a way that the mosque might have sometimes not given them the same level of question, I think, in this regard, and one that's very important to consider. I think the next question was about Sufism's contemporary place in the world today. To make a long story short, it's still very much around and still plays a very major role in Muslim life. But the advent of the Enlightenment in various forms worldwide did sort of take some of the more supernatural and mystical aspects of Sufism and put them under scrutiny in a way that sort of weakens Sufi orders in some ways. The Republican project in Turkey with Ataturk was often quite hostile to Sufism and actually closed most of the orders forcibly after 1925, and many of them had to go underground and couldn't operate publicly so easily anymore. And there's still elements of that even floating around today, although it's been dramatically changed in the 21st century. So in the minds of many Muslims, and even those who did not place Islam at the forefront of their consciousness, Sufism, was viewed as sort of, sometimes backwards or, sort of outside the proper way religion should be done in a modern era. That, I would argue, is turning around pretty rapidly today, as it's become clear that, in fact, the Sufis have some very important lessons to teach all of us, as I think, some of what I've said has hopefully proven. And also, better understanding of modern psychology, for instance, suggests that the Sufis really were onto something in terms of their practices as to how to sort of treat various kinds of psychological conditions and how to make people feel better about their place in both this world and the next. So I think now people are starting to move away from this sort of hard Enlightenment idea, anything that doesn't deal with the real time in various kinds of fields and places, and could play a very real role in maybe developing that further in the future. I want to say there was another question I might be overlooking. Am I?
That was the question about whether there was any kind of
friend. But my sense, given that I'm not an expert in the Vedic traditions, is that karma sort of, to some extent, involves some kind of reincarnation, which would probably not pass muster in Islam in any meaningful way. But the idea that your actions play an important part in how you will fit into the religious tradition, and even the way you think about things will play an important part in that tradition, is definitely part of the issue. And we often have narratives of Sufis who decide at some point that they're living a dissolute life that's too tied to this world or to issues that should not be their proper concern, and they probably come running into the Sufi sheikh's house and often interrupt him in the middle of what they're doing to repent and seek his assistance. And it's sort of a very common disjuncture moment for many people who become Sufis, that they're doing their normal lives one day and then all of a sudden they just realize through some kind of experience that everything they're doing is meaningless, and that they really need to completely transform themselves if they're going to be able to move forward with their lives. So I'm not sure that's really a good answer to the question, in part because we need someone who can really do that Indian subcontinent material well, and there's some sort of transcendent ideal it's problematic in some ways, but there is, I think, a grain of truth to it in others. That not all humans are going to be satisfied with just the sort of basic prescriptions of their religion and sort of carrying out the basic duties and then just going home and going about their lives. There are always going to be people for whom this is not enough, and they need to have more to work with, and this is sort of the key to it.
Thank you very much for this fascinating really talk and responses and sharing your wisdom and erudition of years with us today. As we promised at the beginning, we were going to deal with particularities and also universals of humans of the Ottoman Empire, and I hope that by now, after an hour, I meant to actually stop almost 15, 20 minutes ago, but I couldn't because of the demands coming from our audience and also your passionate interest into the subject. I couldn't stop. But I hope.
And this poor one full of thoughts has to take blame
like
for that, because I think I got a little too into the beginning and didn't realize I was taking up too much time.
No,
so it's not your fault. The humility issue comes in here, and I have to take the blame.
It was perfectly fine, and as I said, I hope that we all got some glimpses, some tidbits of wisdoms about the humans of the Ottoman Empire. And I hope that we are going to continue this series next week about Ottoman scientists, from Sufis to scientists. We are going to move next week. And thank you very much to you, John, one more time. And thanks for all the participants who have been intensively following us and also making some suggestions also to improve this series. And I should say, have a great day, be well, and stay well. Bye-bye.
Thank you to everybody.